Hi, friends. Welcome back to True Crime Echoes. Today, we're stepping into one of the darkest chapters in early American history, the Salem Witch Trials. You've probably heard the name before, maybe in school, maybe in movies, but behind the myths and the legends lies a very real story of fear, prejudice, and tragedy. Over the course of just a single year, accusations of witchcraft tore through a small community, leaving more than 20 people dead and hundreds accused. This isn't just a story about witches. It's about how quickly fear can spread, how communities can unravel, and how justice can collapse under the weight of hysteria. Chapter 1. A Town Bound by Faith and Fear. When I think about the late 1600s in New England, the first image that comes to mind is not comfort, not safety, but survival. Salem was a community carved out of hardship. The winters were brutal, the land was demanding, and the people were bound together by an unshakable belief that everything, every blessing, every misfortune was directly tied to God's will. Religion wasn't just a part of life, it was life itself. In Salem, rules weren't just written in law books, they were written in scripture. If you strayed even slightly from the rigid Puritan code, you weren't just seen as rebellious, you were seen as dangerous. Someone who might invite the devil into the community. Imagine living in a world where even laughter at the wrong time could make people whisper about you. Where questioning the minister was equal to questioning God. That was the reality. And then there was the tension between Salem Village and Salem Town. They were close in distance, but worlds apart in mindset. Salem Village was poorer, more rural, with farmers who believed strongly in holding on to tradition. Salem Town, on the other hand, leaned toward commerce, trade, and a more modern way of life. The division created a subtle hostility, a simmering resentment that lingered in the air. It's in that atmosphere of fear, faith, and quiet conflict that the seeds of hysteria could take root. Because when life is uncertain, when crops fail, when sickness spreads, people search for a reason. And if they can't find one in nature, they'll create one in the supernatural. For the people of Salem, witches became that reason. Looking back now, it's easy to say they were superstitious. But imagine being there, a close-knit, suspicious community where every small misfortune begged for an explanation. It wasn't just paranoia, it was survival. And that survival soon turned into suspicion, and that suspicion would erupt into one of the darkest chapters in American history. Chapter 2. The First Signs of Trouble. The story truly begins inside the home of Reverend Samuel Parris, the minister of Salem Village. He wasn't a man widely loved. Many in the community saw him as strict, even greedy, but as the minister, his voice carried weight. And it was under his roof that the first sparks of hysteria appeared. Reverend Parris had a 9-year-old daughter named Betty and an 11-year-old niece named Abigail. At first, they were just ordinary girls, restless and curious, trying to make sense of the rigid world they'd been born into. But they began sneaking away, spending time with a servant in the household named Tituba. She was from the Caribbean, and her stories were unlike anything these Puritan children had ever heard. It's said the girls began dabbling in fortune-telling little games to see who they might marry, or what their futures held. By today's standards, it sounds almost innocent, like kids playing with a Ouija board at a sleepover. But in 1692 in Salem, this was a dangerous line to cross. Not long after, both Betty and Abigail began showing strange, terrifying symptoms. Betty would hide under furniture, scream in pain, and thrash her body in ways that didn't look human. Abigail soon followed with convulsions, sudden fits of crying, and claims of being pinched and bitten by unseen forces. Their young bodies twisted and contorted in ways that horrified everyone who saw them. Imagine being a parent in that world where illness wasn't always seen as medical, but as spiritual. Reverend Parris tried prayers, remedies, anything he could think of, but nothing worked. And as word spread, whispers began to ripple through Salem. Something unnatural was happening in the minister's own home. When a physician was finally called, he couldn't explain the girls' symptoms in any medical terms. His conclusion: the girls were bewitched. And with that single word, bewitched fear turned into frenzy. Because if the devil was bold enough to enter the house of the minister himself, then no one in Salem was safe. Chapter 3. The First Accusations. Once the word bewitched was spoken, Salem shifted. It was as if fear had been given a name, and people now needed someone to blame. And in a society built on suspicion, finding a scapegoat didn't take long. The first name to surface was Tituba, the enslaved woman who lived in the Paris household. She was different. Her skin, her culture, her stories. In a community that demanded conformity, difference was dangerous. For many, it was easier to point the finger at her than to confront the possibility that something unexplained might be happening. But Tituba wasn't the only one. Two other women soon joined her on the list of the accused, Sarah Good and Sarah Osborne. Sarah Good was poor, forced to beg for food from her neighbors. She had a reputation for muttering under her breath, a habit that now seemed suspicious in the heightened climate of fear. Sarah Osborne was another easy target. She rarely went to church, and in Salem, skipping church was practically an open invitation for rumors. She'd also been in a bitter property dispute with a wealthy family, and that alone made her a convenient person to condemn. Think about how quickly this escalated. Two young girls cry out in pain. A doctor says witchcraft, and suddenly the community begins stitching together old grudges, prejudices, and gossip, turning them into evidence. If a woman was outspoken, if she was poor, if she didn't fit neatly into the rigid Puritan mold, she became a suspect. When Tituba, Sarah Good, and Sarah Osborne were brought in for questioning, the atmosphere was thick with tension. The villagers filled the meeting house, eager to see the devil exposed in their midst. Sarah Good denied the charges. Sarah Osborne, weak and ill at the time, also denied them. But Tituba, cornered and terrified, took a different route. She confessed. She told the magistrates that the devil had come to her, that he forced her to sign his book, and that others in the village had signed as well. Whether it was said to save herself from harsher punishment, or whether it was coerced out of her through fear, her confession fanned the flames of hysteria. Because now the devil wasn't just in the abstract, it had names, faces, neighbors. That was all Salem needed. One confession, no matter how questionable, validated every fear they had. And from that moment forward, the hunt for witches had truly begun. Chapter 4. The fire spreads. Tituba's confession was like striking a match in a room filled with dry straw. The people of Salem had been waiting for proof, something tangible to explain their fears, and now they had it. Her words gave shape to the unseen. The devil was real, he had followers, and they were living among them. Almost overnight, whispers turned into accusations. Children claimed to see specters in the night. Women insisted they were tormented in their dreams, and men spoke of strange illnesses that had no natural explanation. Every misfortune failed crops, sudden sickness, even arguments between neighbors suddenly had a new source: witchcraft. The thing about fear is that it spreads faster than reason. Once one person pointed a finger, others followed. If your child had a fever, maybe it wasn't the harsh winter or poor nutrition. Maybe it was your neighbor casting spells. If your cow stopped producing milk, maybe it wasn't disease, it was the woman down the road with a sharp tongue and a reputation for being unfriendly. And in this frenzy, more names began to emerge. Women who didn't attend church every Sunday, widows without male protection, people who lived on the fringes of society, they all became easy targets. The community's mistrust of outsiders and anyone different transformed into a weapon. The more Tituba spoke, the more elaborate her story became. She described animals that carried out the devil's work, strange gatherings in the forest, and a mysterious book filled with signatures of those who had pledged themselves to evil. Every detail fueled the crowd's imagination. Her words weren't just testimony, they were fuel for a collective nightmare. And it worked. The magistrates, desperate for answers, believed her. The villagers, already terrified, hung on to every word. Each confession, each accusation, became proof that witchcraft was real and rampant. It's chilling to think about how quickly logic can collapse under the weight of fear. Salem had crossed a threshold. What began with two young girls acting strangely had now spiraled into a full-blown hunt for witches, and in the eyes of the community, no one was safe. Chapter 5. The Women Who Couldn't Escape. With the hysteria spreading, the spotlight turned more harshly onto the first women accused, Sarah Good, Sarah Osborne, and Tituba. Their names carried the weight of every rumor, every suspicion, and every prejudice Salem had been harboring. Sarah Good was perhaps the easiest target. She was poor, often forced to beg for food from her neighbors. People already looked at her with disdain. They said she mumbled under her breath when she was turned away, and in that climate even muttering sounded like cursing. Her poverty wasn't just seen as unfortunate, it was considered suspicious. In Salem, to be poor was to be vulnerable, and vulnerability often became guilt. Then there was Sarah Osborne. She rarely went to church, which was practically unthinkable in Puritan society. Her independence, her unwillingness to follow the rigid rules, made her an outsider. On top of that, she had been involved in a bitter land dispute with a powerful family. And in Salem, grudges had long memories. The witchcraft accusations gave her enemies the perfect opportunity to strike. Tituba, trapped in her own position as an enslaved woman, had no real chance to defend herself. Her confession, whether forced or strategic, sealed her fate as both a victim and a catalyst. For Salem, she became living proof of the devil's work, even though her testimony was born out of fear. What's striking when you look back is how transparent the pattern was. Those who didn't conform, the poor, the ill, the outsiders, the ones who spoke too freely, were the first to be accused. The accusations weren't just about witchcraft. They were about power control and survival in a society that punished difference. When the women were brought before the magistrates, the questions weren't really meant to uncover truth. They were meant to confirm suspicion. Sarah Good's pleas of innocence were dismissed. Sarah Osborne, already sick and frail, was barely able to defend herself. And Tituba's fantastical confession only tightened the noose around them all. By the end of those hearings, it was clear Salem wasn't just hunting witches. Salem was hunting anyone who didn't fit the mold. And as the accusations spread, the boundaries of who could be next grew wider until no one could feel safe. Chapter 6. When the Respected Fell. At first, it was easy for the community to believe that witches were only found on the margins of society. The poor, the outcasts, the ones already looked down upon, they fit the narrative. But everything shifted when the accusations reached the doorsteps of Salem's most respected citizens. Rebecca Nurse was 71 years old, frail, soft-spoken, and a devoted member of the church. She was the kind of woman many saw as a model of piety and goodness. Yet, in 1692, even she was accused of practicing witchcraft. For the villagers, it was shocking. If someone like Rebecca Nurse could be a witch, then what did that mean for the rest of them? Then there was Martha Corey. She, too, was known for her devotion to the church. When the trials began, she openly doubted the truth of the accusations, questioning whether these children and their fits were really proof of the devil's work. But in Salem, skepticism was dangerous. To question the hysteria was to align yourself with evil. Before long, Martha herself was accused. These accusations shook the foundation of the community. If the devil could corrupt even the most faithful, then truly no one was beyond suspicion. Families who had once worshipped side by side began to look at one another with fear. Neighbors who had shared meals now whispered behind closed doors. What makes this part of the story so haunting is how quickly fear can turn into betrayal. The same people who had once respected Rebecca Nurse and Martha Corey now turned away, or worse, pointed their fingers to save themselves. The message was clear: in Salem, goodness was no shield. Anyone could be branded a witch. And as these cases showed, the trials weren't about finding truth anymore. They were about feeding the fire. The boundaries of suspicion kept expanding, swallowing up not just the vulnerable, but also the strong, the faithful, and the revered. Salem had become a place where no reputation, no piety, and no history of goodness could protect you. Chapter 7. The Weight of Silence. Among the many tragedies of Salem, few are as powerful or as haunting as the story of Giles Corey. He was an elderly farmer, well into his 80s, and the husband of Martha Corey, who had already been accused of witchcraft. Giles loved his wife and defended her openly, insisting she was innocent. But in Salem, defending the accused was as dangerous as being accused yourself. Soon Giles found his own name added to the growing list of supposed witches. He was dragged into the courtroom, asked to enter a plea, guilty or not guilty. But Giles refused. His silence wasn't cowardice. It was a calculated act of resistance. He knew that if he entered a plea and was convicted, the court would seize his land, leaving nothing for his children. By saying nothing, he hoped to protect his family's inheritance even if it cost him his life. The court would not let his silence stand. They turned to a punishment as old as English law, peine forte et dure. He was stripped, laid on the ground, and heavy stones were placed on his chest. The weight grew heavier with each passing hour. The intention was clear: force him to speak or crush him until he broke. But Giles never broke. For 2 days he endured the unimaginable. Witnesses said that as the weight crushed the breath from his body, he never begged for mercy. Instead, with his final strength, he uttered just 3 words: more weight. Then he was gone. The death of Giles Corey became a symbol of the cruelty and madness of the trials. He was not convicted, yet he died under the weight of injustice, literally. His land was preserved for his heirs, but his story remains one of the darkest reminders of what fear can do when it replaces reason. In Salem, his silence spoke louder than any confession ever could, and yet the trials pressed on with no sign of slowing down. Chapter 8. Signs of the Devil. As the trials grew, so did the so-called evidence. By today's standards, it sounds absurd, but in 1692, Salem, these strange tests and superstitions carried the weight of proof. One of the most infamous was the witch cake. It wasn't a cake in the way we think of it. It was a grotesque mixture of rye flour and the urine of the afflicted child. The idea was that if you fed this to a dog, the animal would reveal the witch who had cursed the victim. If the dog convulsed, barked strangely, or even looked at someone, that person could be accused. Imagine that a neighbor's fate sealed by the behavior of a hungry dog. Then there were the witch marks. Moles, scars, or even simple blemishes on the skin were seen as proof of a pact with the devil. If the mark was insensitive to touch, if a pin didn't draw blood, it was declared the devil's brand. In a time without science, a freckle could become a death sentence. But perhaps the most dangerous of all was spectral evidence. Children and other accusers would claim they saw a ghostly version of the accused tormenting them in visions or dreams. There was no way to disprove it, no defense, no logic that could stand against fear. If someone said they saw your spirit pinching them, the court accepted it as fact. These methods reveal just how much the trials were stacked against the accused. Evidence wasn't about truth, it was about feeding hysteria. And the more outlandish the claim, the more people believed it. Looking back, it's chilling to realize how quickly a society can abandon reason. Salem turned household remedies, birthmarks, and nightmares into weapons, and those weapons would soon condemn more lives, tightening the noose around anyone who dared stand out. Chapter 9. The Gallows. By the summer of 1692, Salem was no longer just a town in panic. It was a place consumed by fear. The jails were overflowing with men, women, and even children accused of witchcraft. Some were respected church members, others were social outcasts. It didn't matter anymore. Once the finger was pointed, you were already halfway to the gallows. 13 women and 5 men would eventually be sentenced to death. They were marched to Gallows Hill, a place that has become forever tied to Salem's dark history. There, in front of neighbors, friends, and family, they were hanged. No proper burials were allowed. Their bodies were often left hanging as a grim warning before being buried in shallow, unmarked graves. What's perhaps most tragic is how quickly the accusations escalated. Sarah Good, already living in poverty, was hanged despite her protests of innocence. Her 4-year-old daughter Dorothy was imprisoned, just a child treated like a criminal. Rebecca Nurse, an elderly, devout woman, was executed even though many in the community believed she was innocent. The court ignored the doubts. And then there was Giles Corey, who refused to enter a plea. He believed that by saying nothing, his land would remain in his family. The court responded with a punishment almost too cruel to imagine. They pressed him stone by stone, weight upon weight, until his body gave out. His last words, it said, were more weight. It was both defiance and desperation, a man refusing to play into the madness, even as it cost him his life. These executions weren't just punishments, they were spectacles. The fear in the crowd reinforced the power of the court. The ministers preached that justice was being done, that God's will was being served. But in truth, it was hysteria given legal authority. When I think about it, this chapter of history isn't just about witches, it's about what happens when reason is abandoned, when fear and prejudice replace evidence and truth. Ordinary people became executioners not with their hands, but with their silence, their whispers, their willingness to believe the unbelievable. And all of it left scars that Salem could never truly erase. Chapter 10. The Aftermath. By the spring of 1693, the hysteria that had consumed Salem finally began to lose its grip. The accusations had grown too wild, too far-reaching. When ministers, respected elders, and even prominent families were being targeted, people started to realize that something had gone terribly wrong. Governor Phipps eventually stepped in and put an end to the trials. But by then, 20 people had been executed, and hundreds of lives were scarred forever. Families torn apart, reputations destroyed, and a community left shaken by the realization of what fear and fanaticism had made them capable of. In the years that followed, there were apologies, though apologies could never bring back the dead. Some judges admitted their mistakes. Ministers later called the trials a great tragedy, a stain on their faith. Decades later, descendants of those accused worked tirelessly to clear their names. And in 2001, more than 3 centuries after the executions, the state of Massachusetts officially exonerated the last of the victims. It was a symbolic gesture, but an important one, acknowledging the injustice that had taken place. When I reflect on the Salem Witch Trials, what stands out to me isn't just the superstition or the fear of witches. It's the way fear can spread like fire. It's how quickly a community can turn against its own when reason gives way to panic. And maybe most haunting of all, it's how ordinary people, neighbors, friends, even family can become complicit in something unthinkable. The story of Salem isn't just a cautionary tale from the 1600s. It's a reminder for us today. Hysteria, prejudice, blind belief, they're not just relics of the past. They're dangers we still face in different forms in different contexts. Salem is a warning of what happens when we stop questioning, when we let fear decide who is guilty and who deserves to be silenced. In the end, the Salem Witch Trials remind us that truth matters, that justice demands more than rumor and fear, and that history has a way of holding up a mirror, forcing us to confront not only what happened then, but what could still happen now. And that's the story of the Salem Witch Trials, a grim reminder of what happens when fear replaces reason. Looking back now, it's easy to shake our heads and wonder how people could have believed so strongly in witches. But maybe the real lesson is this. Hysteria can take many forms, and it often finds a way to disguise itself as truth. The past teaches us that when we stop questioning, when we give in to fear, we risk repeating the same mistakes. Thank you for spending this time with me on True Crime Echoes. If you found this story as haunting and thought-provoking as I did, don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Until then, stay curious, stay safe, and remember, history always has echoes.